Shadows in South Philadelphia hide more than just secrets. They hide monsters. Every night, ordinary people walk inches past the invisible borders of an underworld they refuse to acknowledge, praying their ignorance will keep them safe. But sometimes, innocence collides violently with that darkness. What you are about to hear is not a Hollywood script or a romanticized mob fable. It is the documented account of an ordinary woman who made a split-second decision in a rain-soaked alleyway. She put her life on the line for an animal, absorbing 5 lethal knife wounds meant for a creature she didn't know. She expected to die on that pavement. What she never expected was that her reckless act of mercy would bind her forever to the most dangerous syndicate in the city. Rain slashed against the cracked pavement of Kensington Avenue in a torrential, freezing downpour that chased every sensible person indoors. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of night where the cold seeps directly into the bone. Charlie Lawson, a 26-year-old emergency veterinary technician, pushed her way out of the back exit of the North Star Animal Clinic. She was exhausted to the point of nausea. Her scrubs were stained with iodine and bleach, her muscles ached from holding down panicked strays, and her bank account was overdrawn by $40. All she wanted was the damp warmth of her tiny apartment and a solid 10 hours of sleep. She popped open a flimsy black umbrella that immediately threatened to invert in the wind. As she turned down the narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut to the subway station, the city's ambient noise, the distant wail of sirens, the rumble of the elevated train, seemed to muffle under the heavy rain. That was when she heard it. It wasn't the typical scuffle of feral cats fighting over a dumpster. It was a low, guttural snarl that vibrated with a terrifying primal intensity, followed immediately by the sickening thud of steel connecting with bone. Charlie froze. Common sense, honed by years of living in a rough neighborhood, screamed at her to turn around. Keep walking. Mind your own business. But the snarling was abruptly cut short by a sharp, pained whimper, a sound she had heard 1,000 times in the clinic. It was the sound of a dog in agonizing distress. Dropping her umbrella, she crept toward the shadows behind a rusted industrial dumpster. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Cornered against the brick wall was a massive cane corso. The dog was a breathtaking specimen of raw muscle and dark brindle fur, easily weighing over 130 pounds. But right now, the animal was on the defensive, its front left leg giving way. Standing over the dog were 2 men. They weren't vagrants. They were wearing expensive leather jackets ruined by the rain. One of them, a heavy-set man, later identified in police reports as Tommy Rojas, was holding a heavy steel pipe. The other, a lean, wired man named Jimmy Miller, was gripping a serrated hunting knife. "Just finish the damn thing," Tommy spat, wiping rain from his face. "Costello loves this mutt more than his own mother. We drop the dog on his porch. He gets the message. The Vitiello family runs the port now." "I'm trying," Jimmy snarled, stepping forward. "Bastard took a chunk out of my calf. Hold him down." Tommy swung the pipe, striking the dog across the ribs. The cane corso let out a horrific yelp, dropping to its knees, though its teeth remained bared in defiant fury. Jimmy raised the hunting knife, preparing to plunge it directly into the animal's neck. Charlie didn't think. The adrenaline overrode every survival instinct she possessed. She didn't care about the Vitiello family or whoever Costello was. She only saw a helpless creature about to be slaughtered. Her hand shot into the deep pocket of her scrubs, her fingers wrapping around the heavy, medical-grade trauma shears she used to cut through plaster casts. "Hey!" Charlie screamed, her voice tearing through the sound of the rain. The 2 men whipped around, startled. In that split second of distraction, the cane corso lunged, its massive jaws snapping onto Tommy's thigh. Tommy shrieked, dropping the steel pipe as the dog's teeth sank through leather and muscle. "You stupid bitch!" Jimmy roared. Realizing the element of surprise was gone and his partner was going down, his rage redirected entirely to the woman who had interrupted them. He lunged at Charlie. She brought the heavy metal shears up, swinging them wildly. The blunt metal struck Jimmy across the cheekbone, opening a gash, but he was too fast, fueled by adrenaline and malicious intent. He slammed his body weight into her, driving Charlie hard against the wet brick wall. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. "Mind your own business," Jimmy hissed, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and copper. He thrust the hunting knife upward. The first strike caught Charlie just beneath her ribs on the left side. The sensation wasn't immediately painful. It felt like being punched with a block of ice. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock as her hands reflexively grabbed his wrist. Jimmy wrenched the blade free and drove it in again. The second and third wounds punctured her right abdomen, slicing through muscle and tearing into her colon. Charlie screamed then, a raw, terrifying sound that echoed off the alley walls. She kicked out, trying to push him away, but her legs were rapidly losing strength. Jimmy raised the knife higher. The fourth strike buried itself deep into her left shoulder, pinning her against the brickwork. The fifth and final blow was a sweeping slash across her side as he ripped the blade away. She collapsed, sliding down the rough brick wall until she hit the wet pavement. The freezing rain mixed immediately with the dark, heavy heat pouring from her body. But Jimmy didn't have time to finish the job. A terrifying roar erupted behind him. The cane Corso, having released Tommy, launched its 130-pound frame directly through the air. The dog hit Jimmy squarely in the chest, snapping its jaws over the man's forearm. With a bone-crushing crunch, Jimmy dropped the knife, screaming in agony as the dog dragged him violently to the ground, shaking its head to tear the tendons. "Get it off! Get it off!" Jimmy wailed. Tommy, limping and bleeding profusely from his leg, managed to grab Jimmy by the collar of his jacket, pulling him desperately toward the mouth of the alley. The dog, heavily bruised and limping itself, let go only to position itself directly over Charlie's fallen body, barking with a ferocity that shook the air. The two thugs scrambled into the darkness, leaving a trail of their own destruction behind. Charlie lay on the asphalt, her vision blurring at the edges. The world was turning grey, the sound of the rain fading into a distant static. Every breath she took felt like swallowing broken glass. Her hands, slick and warm, clutched at her stomach, trying uselessly to hold herself together. A heavy, wet nose pressed against her cheek. She forced her eyes open a fraction. The massive dog was lying beside her, its huge head resting gently on her chest, right over her slowing heart. It was whimpering softly, a stark contrast to the monster it had been moments before. "Good boy," Charlie whispered, her voice bubbling with fluid. She managed to lift one trembling, blood-soaked hand, burying her fingers into the thick fur behind the dog's ears. She felt the animal's warmth. She heard the distant sound of approaching sirens, likely called by a neighbor who heard the screams. And then Charlie Lawson closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. Consciousness returned not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a suffocating black tar. The first thing Charlie registered was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator. The second was a searing, consuming pain that radiated from her core, radiating outward like a web of fire with every heartbeat. She tried to open her eyes, but the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the intensive care unit at Philadelphia General Hospital forced them shut. Panic flared. She tried to sit up, but her body felt paralyzed, pinned down by tubes and wires. Hey, don't move. You're safe, Charlie. Try to relax." A soft voice broke through the panic. Charlie forced her eyes open again, blinking against the glare to see a woman in blue scrubs standing beside her bed, checking an IV bag. "Wabudjo, water," Charlie managed to croak, her throat feeling like sandpaper. The nurse smiled sympathetically, lifting a small sponge swab dipped in ice water to Charlie's cracked lips. "Just a little bit. You've been through a major trauma. I'm Nurse Carter. You're in the ICU." Memories flooded back with the violence of a physical blow. The rain, the alley, the knife tearing into her flesh, the massive, beautiful dog standing over her. "The dog!" Charlie gasped, her heart monitor suddenly spiking, emitting a rapid, panicked beeping. Did they kill him?" Nurse Carter placed a gentle hand on Charlie's forehead. "The dog is fine, sweetie. Animal control picked him up, but he was transferred to a private vet. He survived. You saved his life." She paused, her expression turning slightly grim. "But you almost lost yours. 5 stab wounds. You lost 4 pints on the street. Dr. Stanton had you in surgery for 7 hours repairing your bowel and an artery near your collarbone. You've been out for 2 days. 2 days. Before Charlie could process the magnitude of what had happened, the heavy double doors of her glass-walled ICU room pushed open. A man stepped in. He wasn't wearing a doctor's coat. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarettes. He flashed a golden badge at the nurse. "Detective Harrison Cole, Philly PD," he said, his voice raspy and exhausted. "I need a few minutes with the victim, Carter." "She literally just woke up, Detective," the nurse protested fiercely. 5 minutes, and if her vitals spike, you're out." Carter squeezed Charlie's hand reassuringly before stepping out, closing the glass door. Detective Cole pulled up a plastic chair, sitting heavily beside the bed. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, staring at Charlie with a mixture of pity and severe apprehension. "Miss Lawson." "Glad you're still with us," Cole started, clicking his pen. "I'm going to be straight with you. The guys who did this to you, they're ghosts. No cameras in that alley, and the rain washed away most of the physical evidence, except for your blood." Charlie swallowed hard, the pain in her side flaring. "They were trying to kill the dog. They said a name, Costello. They wanted to send a message to Costello." Detective Cole stopped writing. His eyes slowly rose from the notepad, locking on to Charlie. The air in the room seemed to suddenly grow cold and heavy. "You're absolutely sure about that name? Costello?" Cole asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Yes," Charlie whispered. "Who is he?" Cole let out a long, slow breath, running a hand over his face. "Miss Lawson, do you watch the news? Do you know anything about the organized crime dynamics in this city?" Charlie shook her head weakly. "I work nights. I take care of animals." "Well, you just took care of an animal belonging to Demetrius Costello," Cole said, leaning closer, his tone urgent. "Costello is the head of the largest, most violent syndicate on the East Coast. Racketeering, port smuggling, extortion. The FBI has been trying to nail him to the wall for a decade, but anyone who agrees to testify against him has a habit of disappearing. He is ruthless, untouchable, and deeply paranoid." Charlie felt a cold knot form in her stomach that had nothing to do with her surgical wounds. "The men who attacked you," Cole continued, "were likely foot soldiers for the Vitiello family, a rival faction from New Jersey trying to muscle in on Costello's territory. Hitting his dog, a cane corso named Brutus that goes everywhere with him, was meant to be an insult, a provocation. "I just wanted to help the dog," Charlie said, tears of exhaustion and sudden, sharp terror pricking her eyes. "I didn't know." "I believe you," Cole said softly, But you need to understand the position you're in now. The Vitiellos might realize you saw their faces. They might decide to tie up loose ends. And as for Costello, men like him don't like civilians getting involved in their business. They don't like owing debts. Sometimes, to men like him, a witness is just a liability. Cole handed her a plain white business card with his cell number scrawled on the back. The hospital has you listed under a Jane Doe protocol for now. No visitors allowed. But secrets don't stay secret long in this city. When you get out, you lock your doors. You call me if you see a car idling on your street. Do you understand? Charlie nodded, her throat tight with a terror she couldn't articulate. For the next 4 days, Charlie's recovery was a blur of excruciating physical therapy, heavy painkillers, and a suffocating paranoid isolation. Every time the door to her room opened, she braced herself for an assassin. She barely slept, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had survived the alley only to become a casualty in a mob war she knew nothing about. By the 5th day, her insurance dictated she be moved out of the ICU and prepared for discharge. Despite Dr. Stanton's protests that she needed an inpatient rehabilitation facility for at least another week, Charlie adamantly refused. The hospital felt like a trap. Anyone could walk in wearing scrubs. She needed her own space, her deadbolts, her familiar 4 walls. Against medical advice, she signed her discharge papers. A social worker arranged for a medical transport to take her back to her apartment in South Philly. As the van pulled away from the hospital, Charlie looked out the window at the grey, unforgiving city. She felt incredibly small, completely alone, and entirely marked. Charlie's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a dilapidated walk-up above an old laundromat. The stairs were a particular kind of torture. Gripping the handrail with white-knuckled intensity, she took them one agonizing step at a time, her breath hitching as her stitches pulled tight across her abdomen. By the time she reached her door, she was drenched in cold sweat. She unlocked the 3 deadbolts she had installed herself, pushed the door open, and locked them instantly behind her. The apartment was small, smelling faintly of old coffee and the lavender detergent she used. It was messy, exactly as she had left it the night of the attack. A half-drank mug sat on the counter. Her mail was piled on the small table. It was a snapshot of a normal life that felt like it belonged to a completely different person. She shuffled to the worn velvet sofa and collapsed onto it, clutching a throw pillow against her stomach to support her wounded core. The silence of the apartment, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs, every siren wailing blocks away, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into her heart. She survived the night by staring at the door, a kitchen knife resting on the coffee table beside her. The next morning broke with a dull, overcast grey light filtering through her cheap blinds. It was 9 a.m. Charlie had just managed to choke down a piece of dry toast and her morning regimen of antibiotics and painkillers when the atmosphere of the street outside shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise. It was the distinct, heavy rumble of powerful engines, followed by a synchronized, unnatural silence. Charlie froze, her mug of water halfway to her mouth. She slowly set it down. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, echoing the erratic rhythm from the ICU monitor. She forced herself off the sofa, biting her lip to keep from crying out at the pain, and limped toward the front window. She used 2 fingers to part the blinds just a fraction of an inch. Her breath completely left her lungs. The narrow working-class street outside was completely blocked off. Spanning the entire block were 5 identical, midnight black Cadillac Escalades, their windows heavily tinted. They had parked with aggressive precision, effectively barricading both ends of the street, preventing any other vehicles from entering or leaving. Before Charlie could even process the sight, The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect, terrifying unison. 20 men stepped out onto the pavement. They were not the street-level thugs she had encountered in the alley. These men moved with the disciplined, lethal grace of a private military force. They all wore sharply tailored dark suits, black overcoats and earpieces. They didn't look around nervously. They scanned the rooftops, the alleyways, and the neighboring windows with cold, calculating efficiency. Several of them kept their hands resting casually near the lapels of their jackets, the distinct bulge of shoulder holsters visible even from the second floor. Charlie felt a wave of profound dizziness. They found me, she thought, panic rising in her throat like bile. Detective Cole was right. I'm a liability. She backed away from the window, her hands trembling so violently she knocked a framed photo off a side table. It shattered on the floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. Down on the street, the formation of men shifted. From the center escalade, the rear door opened. A man stepped out into the crisp morning air. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like old, dangerous money. He wore a bespoke charcoal, three-piece suit and a black cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his jawline sharp, his expression chiseled out of absolute stone. He radiated power, the kind of quiet, absolute authority that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Demetrius Costello. But it was what stepped out of the vehicle after him that made Charlie stop breathing entirely. It was the cane Corso, Brutus. The dog's chest was heavily bandaged, and he walked with a slight limp, but his head was held high. He stood immediately at Demetrius's left side, a massive gargoyle of muscle and loyalty. Demetrius looked up. His dark, piercing eyes seemed to look straight through the brick facade of the building, locking exactly onto Charlie's window. He knew she was there. He knew everything. Charlie's instinct was to run, to scramble out the fire escape, but her battered body couldn't handle a flight of stairs, let alone a chase. She was trapped. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. Not one person, but several. Thud. 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 They stopped directly outside her apartment. Charlie backed away until her spine hit the wall of her tiny kitchen. She grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, holding it out with two shaking hands. It was a pathetic defense against 20 armed men, but it was all she had. A sharp, authoritative knock rapped against the wood of her front door. Miss Lawson, a deep, resonant voice, called from the other side. It was a voice used to commanding rooms, a voice that carried an undercurrent of absolute finality. "Open the door." "Go away," Charlie cried out, her voice cracking. "I've already spoken to the police. I don't know anything." Silence stretched in the hallway. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time, but infinitely more dangerous. "Miss Lawson, if I wanted you harmed, you would not have woken up in that hospital. I have brought a friend who wishes to see you. Please, open the door. I prefer not to break it down and frighten you further." Charlie stared at the deadbolts. The sheer confidence in his voice told her the locks were mere suggestions to him. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the knife. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the 3 deadbolts. Click, click, click. She turned the handle and pulled the door open a few inches, leaving the chain lock engaged. Demetrius Costello stood in her hallway. Up close, the aura of danger surrounding him was almost suffocating. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of polished obsidian. Flanking him were 4 massive bodyguards, their expressions blank, their eyes scanning the interior of her apartment. And sitting patiently at Demetrius's feet was Brutus. The moment the dog saw Charlie through the crack in the door, his entire demeanor changed. The terrifying guard dog let out a high-pitched, joyful whine. His stump of a tail began to wag furiously, and he practically shoved his large snout through the opening, trying to lick her hand. Charlie gasped, tears instantly springing to her eyes. She forgot the terrifying mob boss, forgot the armed men, forgot the pain in her abdomen. She reached through the gap, her fingers finding the soft fur behind the dog's ears, scratching the exact spot she had touched in the alley. "He's okay," she sobbed quietly. "You're okay, buddy." Demetrius Costello watched this interaction with an expression of intense, quiet study. He didn't speak until Charlie finally looked up at him, her eyes wide and fearful. "Take the chain off the door, Charlie," Demetrius said softly. It wasn't a request. She complied automatically, her hands shaking as she undid the chain and stepped back. Demetrius walked into her tiny, messy apartment. He seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. He didn't sit down. He looked around at the meager furnishings, the chipped paint, and finally, down at the heavy bandages visible beneath Charlie's loose t-shirt. "My name is Demetrius Costello," he said, his voice smooth, carrying a faint trace of a South Philly accent buried under years of refined elocution. "2 nights ago, my enemies tried to take the one thing in this world that matters to me. They tried to send me a message in blood." He looked down at Brutus, who had limped over to lean his massive weight against Charlie's leg. "You stepped between the knife and my family," Demetrius continued, his gaze returning to Charlie, his dark eyes burning with an unreadable intensity. "You took 5 blades meant for my shadow. You did not know me. You did not know the war you were stepping into. You just fought." I couldn't let them hurt him," Charlie whispered, gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself upright as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Demetrius took a step closer. The bodyguards in the hallway remained perfectly still, watching. "In my world, Miss Lawson, we operate on a ledger of blood and respect," Demetrius said quietly. "Debts are owed, and debts are paid. The men who attacked you have already been dealt with. The Vitiello family has been informed that they have crossed a line from which there is no return." Charlie felt the blood drain from her face. Dealt with. She knew exactly what that meant. "But that brings me to my problem," Demetrius said, tilting his head slightly. "You are now on the board. The Vitiellos know what you did. They know you ruined their hit. To them, you are a loose end. To the police, you are a witness. To the streets, you are a vulnerability." "I won't say anything," Charlie panicked, stepping back. "I swear, let me just pack a bag. I can leave the city. I can disappear." "No," Demetrius said, the word cutting through the air like a whip. "You are not running." He reached into his breast pocket. Charlie flinched, but he only pulled out a heavy platinum money clip. He didn't offer her cash. Instead, he snapped his fingers. 2 of the men from the hallway stepped into the apartment. They were carrying heavy black duffel bags. Without a word, they walked past Charlie and set the bags down in the corner of her living room. What is this?" Charlie stammered. "I do not pay off blood debts with a check, Charlie," Demetrius said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute sincerity. "You bled for my family. That means you are now under the protection of the Costello family. Total, uncompromising protection." He gestured to the window. "The 20 men outside? They are not an escort. They are your new shadow. 4 men will be stationed at your front door, 24 hours a day. 2 will remain in the alley. 2 will follow you to the clinic, the grocery store, and everywhere in between. The rest will secure the perimeter of this neighborhood." Charlie's jaw dropped. You can't do that. You can't just occupy my street, I can't live like a prisoner." "You are not a prisoner. You are a sovereign entity under my flag," Demetrius corrected smoothly. "You saved my dog's life. Now I am going to save yours, whether you want me to or not." He turned to leave, his coat swirling around his ankles. He stopped at the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. "Oh, and Charlie?" Demetrius said, a faint, dangerous smirk playing on his lips for the first time. "Brutus will be staying with you during your recovery. He seems to prefer your company. If you need anything at all, you tell my men." Before Charlie could utter another word of protest, Demetrius Costello stepped out into the hallway. The door was pulled shut behind him by one of the massive bodyguards, who immediately took up a stoic position in her living room. Charlie stood completely frozen in her kitchen. She looked at the bodyguard, who stared blankly at the wall. She looked down at Brutus, who had already curled up on her small rug, letting out a contented sigh, and then she looked out the window, realizing with absolute, terrifying clarity that her life as an ordinary woman was officially over. Time morphed into a suffocating, surreal loop for Charlie Lawson. The vibrant, chaotic energy of South Philadelphia was entirely muted on her block, replaced by the chilling, militaristic efficiency of the Costello Syndicate. Living under Demetrius's protection was not merely an inconvenience, it was a total override of her existence. When she looked out her window, she didn't see her eccentric neighbors or the usual kids playing stickball in the street. She saw men in tailored dark suits standing in the freezing December rain, their eyes scanning every vehicle that dared to slow down. The local laundromat beneath her apartment had practically been commandeered as a makeshift guardhouse. Her only anchor to reality was Brutus. The massive cane Corso never left her side. If Charlie moved from the sofa to the kitchen, 130 pounds of muscle followed, his heavy paws clicking against the cheap linoleum. His wounds were healing, though he still favored his front leg. In the quiet, terrifying hours of the night, when Charlie's own surgical wounds burned and her mind replayed the flash of the hunting knife, she would bury her face in Brutus's dark, brindle fur. He was the only creature in this new, terrifying world who didn't look at her like a problem to be solved. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the heavy deadbolts of her front door clicked open. Charlie instinctively tensed, grabbing the edge of the kitchen counter. Demetrius Costello stepped inside, bringing the biting winter cold in with him. He was flanked not by his usual hulking bodyguards, but by a distinguished older man carrying a leather medical bag. "Charlie," Demetrius said, his voice maintaining that smooth, dangerous calm. He unbuttoned his cashmere overcoat, his dark eyes sweeping over her pale face and the oversized sweater she wore to hide her bandages. "This is Dr. Sterling. He is the former chief of surgery at Penn Medicine. He works exclusively for my family now. He is here to check your incisions." "I have a follow-up scheduled at the free clinic tomorrow," Charlie protested weakly, crossing her arms protectively over her stomach. "I don't need—" "You are not stepping foot in a public clinic," Demetrius interrupted, stepping further into the small living room. "The Vitiello family is currently offering $250,000 to anyone who can provide your exact location. You are staying exactly where you are." A cold knot tightened in Charlie's chest. $250,000. To the desperate people in her neighborhood, that wasn't just money, it was a way out. She suddenly viewed her cheap apartment not as a sanctuary, but as a glass box suspended over a shark tank. Dr. Sterling was gentle and professional. He directed her to sit on the edge of the sofa and carefully removed the surgical dressings. Charlie kept her eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling, trying to ignore the humiliating vulnerability of the situation. What she couldn't ignore, however, was the heavy weight of Demetrius's gaze. He stood by the window, watching the procedure in total silence. When the doctor revealed the angry, purple lacerations crisscrossing her torso, Demetrius's jaw visibly tightened, a dangerous muscle ticking in his cheek. "The sutures are holding beautifully, Miss Lawson," Dr. Sterling murmured, applying a fresh, sterile dressing. "But you are anemic, and your stress levels are entirely too high for optimal healing. You need complete peace." Demetrius escorted the doctor out, murmuring low instructions in the hallway before returning alone. He walked over to the tiny kitchenette, picking up Charlie's half-empty bottle of generic painkillers. He studied the label with a look of profound disdain before setting it down. "This environment is no longer sustainable," Demetrius stated, looking around the cramped, drafty apartment. "My men intercepted a delivery driver 3 blocks from here this morning. He wasn't carrying food. He was carrying a suppressed Glock 19 and a map of this building." Charlie's breath hitched. They tried to come here?" "They tried," Demetrius corrected, his tone turning glacial. "They failed. But it proves Carlo Vitiello is accelerating his timetable. He views your survival as an insult to his family's reputation. South Philly has too many alleys, too many fire escapes, too many blind spots. You are packing a bag, Charlie. You are leaving with me tonight." "Leaving? To where?" Panic flared in her eyes. "You can't just kidnap me." Demetrius closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped just inches from her, forcing Charlie to tilt her head up to meet his dark, unreadable eyes. Up close, he smelled of cedar wood, expensive espresso, and something fundamentally dangerous. "If I wanted to kidnap you, Charlie, I wouldn't have knocked on your door," he said softly, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I'm trying to keep you breathing. You bled for my dog. You bled for my family. I do not forget debts. Tonight you move to my estate in Radnor. It is a fortress. No one gets in without my explicit permission. Not the police, not the FBI, and certainly not the Vitiello Syndicate." He looked down at Brutus, who had wedged himself between them, leaning heavily against Demetrius's immaculate suit trousers. Demetrius reached down, his large, scarred hand resting gently on the dog's head. "Brutus misses his own bed," Demetrius added, a flicker of something almost resembling warmth passing through his eyes before vanishing. "And he refuses to leave you, so you are both coming home." Iron gates towering 15 feet high, flanked by stone gargoyles and security cameras, swung open smoothly in the dead of night. Charlie sat rigid in the back of the armored escalade, her hands trembling in her lap. The Costello estate in the main line was not merely a house, it was an opulent, sprawling compound hidden behind acres of dense winter forest. The architecture was cold, Gothic stone, practically radiating old money and dark secrets. As the SUV pulled up to the circular driveway, Charlie saw men in tactical gear patrolling the perimeter with quiet, lethal efficiency. Demetrius personally opened her door. He offered his hand. After a moment of hesitation, Charlie placed her cold, shaking fingers in his. His grip was firm, grounding, and surprisingly warm. The interior of the mansion was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, imported marble floors, and the scent of wood smoke and old books filled the air. But to Charlie, it felt like stepping into a beautifully decorated mausoleum. "Silas!" Demetrius called out. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down the side of his neck stepped out of the shadows. He looked more like a mercenary than a butler. "Have Maria show Miss Lawson to the East Wing guest suite," Demetrius instructed. He turned his attention back to Charlie. "You have free reign of the house and the enclosed gardens. Do not approach the perimeter walls. If you need anything, ask Silas." For the next week, Charlie lived in a state of suspended animation. Her physical wounds were healing rapidly under the care of Dr. Sterling, who visited daily, and the high-protein, gourmet meals prepared by the estate's private chef. But her mental state was fraying. She was a ghost haunting a billionaire's fortress. She rarely saw Demetrius during the day. He was a phantom who operated out of a heavy mahogany office behind closed doors, managing a criminal empire while a war raged in the city because of her. Her only solace, again, was Brutus. The dog slept at the foot of her massive, four-poster bed and followed her through the sprawling library and the solarium. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after the alley. A severe winter storm had knocked out the main power grid, leaving the estate running on a low hum of backup generators. The mansion was bathed in the dim, amber glow of emergency lighting. Charlie, unable to sleep, wrapped a thick wool shawl over her silk pajamas and wandered down to the cavernous kitchen to get a glass of water. As she pushed the heavy oak door open, she froze. Demetrius was sitting at the massive marble island. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faded, intricate ink. A glass of amber liquid sat untouched in front of him. He looked exhausted. The mask of the untouchable mob boss had slipped, revealing the heavy, bruising toll of command. "Can't sleep?" Demetrius asked without looking up. His voice echoed slightly in the quiet kitchen. "It's too quiet here," Charlie said truthfully, stepping further into the room. She poured herself a glass of water, acutely aware of his eyes tracking her movements. "You prefer the sound of sirens and gunfire?" he asked, a dry, humorless smile touching his lips. "I prefer feeling like I have a life of my own," she countered softly, leaning against the counter. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time without the lens of pure terror. "How long, Demetrius? How long do I stay locked in this tower?" Demetrius finally looked up. The intensity in his dark eyes pinned her in place. "Until Carlo Vitiello is no longer a threat to you. Until I tear his organization out by the roots." He stood up, walking slowly around the kitchen island until he was standing just a few feet away from her. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. "You think I enjoy this?" Demetrius's voice dropped, raw and dangerous. "I brought a civilian into my home, a woman who looks at me like I am the devil himself. My captains think I have lost my mind. They think I am weak for expending resources to protect a veterinary technician." "Then let me go," Charlie whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I can't," Demetrius replied, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Because if I let you walk out those gates, Carlo will have you skinned alive and hung from an overpass just to prove a point. You belong to the shadows now, Charlie. You bought your ticket the night you picked up those shears." Before Charlie could respond, the heavy silence of the kitchen was shattered by a sound that made Demetrius's blood run cold. It wasn't gunfire. It was the shrill mechanical screech of the estate's perimeter breach alarm. Red emergency lights began strobing violently across the marble floors. The backup generators groaned as the security system fully engaged. Demetrius's demeanor instantly shifted from the exhausted, complex man to the ruthless syndicate boss. He reached to the small of his back, drawing a heavy, matte black handgun with a terrifying, practiced fluidity. "Silas!" Demetrius roared into the hallway. The mercenary appeared seconds later, a customized assault rifle already pressed to his shoulder. "Breach on the western wall, boss. Thermal cameras are picking up 12 heat signatures moving through the tree line. They used shaped charges to blow the iron gate. They're heavy, moving fast." 12 men? Demetrius's eyes narrowed, pure venom lacing his words. Carlo wouldn't send 12 men against my stronghold unless he knew the internal security codes to bypass the secondary grid. We have a rat. Demetrius turned back to Charlie. The romantic tension of seconds prior was entirely vaporized, replaced by the stark, brutal reality of survival. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising in its intensity. "Listen to me very carefully," Demetrius commanded, his face inches from hers. "You take Brutus. You go to the panic room behind the library shelving. You lock the heavy door, and you do not open it for anyone but me or Silas. If anyone else tries to enter—" He pressed a small, cold metal object into her trembling hand. It was a compact 9mm pistol. "You point it at the door and empty the magazine. Do you understand me?" Charlie couldn't speak. She could only stare at the heavy weapon in her hand, the reality of her nightmare crashing down with crushing weight. Gunfire erupted outside the mansion, the sharp, deafening crack of high-caliber rifles echoing through the storm. The war had officially crossed the threshold, and the gilded cage was about to become a slaughterhouse. Deafening echoes of automatic gunfire ripped through the serene, opulent halls of the Radnor estate, shattering the illusion of total security. Charlie sprinted down the long, dimly lit corridor of the East Wing, her bare feet slapping against the cold, imported marble. Every panicked breath tore at the fresh sutures in her abdomen, a brutal reminder of her physical limits. But pure adrenaline pushed the agony to the background. Right beside her, ignoring his own injuries, was Brutus. The massive Cane Corso wasn't whimpering or cowering from the terrifying sounds of the assault. His hackles were raised, his golden eyes scanning the darkness, a low, continuous rumble vibrating in his chest. He was back in his element, a guardian bred for war. "Come on, Brutus, this way," Charlie gasped, gripping the heavy 9mm pistol Demetrius had forced into her hand. The cold metal felt alien and terrifying, slipping slightly in her sweaty palm. She turned the corner toward the grand library. The massive double doors were ajar. According to Demetrius's rushed instructions, the entrance to the fortified panic room was concealed behind the rear mahogany bookshelves. As she pushed through the doors, the ambient amber light of the emergency generators cast long, distorted shadows across the thousands of leather-bound volumes. Charlie rushed toward the back wall, frantically searching for the hidden seam Demetrius had described. "Looking for this, Miss Lawson." The voice came from the darkness near the reading armchairs, smooth and completely devoid of the panic echoing outside. Charlie spun around, raising the pistol with violently shaking hands. Stepping into the dim light was one of Demetrius's own trusted security men, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Carter, who had personally driven the armored SUV that brought her to the estate. But Carter wasn't aiming his weapon at the hallway to protect her. He had his suppressed sidearm leveled directly at Charlie's chest. "Carter, what are you doing?" Charlie stammered, her heart plummeting. "Securing my retirement," Carter replied, a cynical smirk twisting his features. "Demetrius is a visionary, sure, but he's gone soft, putting the entire syndicate on high alert, risking a full-scale war, all for a collateral damage vet tech. It's bad business. Carlo Vitiello offered $3 million for the girl who ruined his hit. I'm just cashing out before this ship sinks." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Put the gun down, Charlie. You don't even know how to take the safety off." A surge of protective fury suddenly eclipsed Charlie's terror. She thought of the alleyway. She thought of Demetrius, exhausted and fighting for his life downstairs because he refused to abandon her. She looked at Brutus, who had positioned himself firmly in front of her. His massive teeth bared in a snarl that promised absolute violence. "I'm not going back to be tortured by Vitiello," Charlie said, her voice dropping the frantic tremble, replacing it with cold, hard resolve. "You don't have a choice," Carter sneered, shifting his aim slightly to point at the dog. "Now call off the mutt, or I put a hollow point through his skull before I take you." That was his fatal mistake. Brutus didn't wait for a command. Recognizing the imminent threat to the woman who had bled for him, the 130-pound dog launched himself like a heat-seeking missile across the library floor. Carter fired in a panic. The suppressed weapon let out a sharp pft, the bullet grazing the dog's thick shoulder, sending a spray of red into the air. But it didn't slow the cane corso down. Brutus slammed into Carter's chest with the force of a freight train, knocking the traitor backward into a heavy oak reading table. The wood splintered under their combined weight. Carter screamed, dropping his gun as Brutus's jaws locked onto his tactical vest, tearing violently at the heavy Kevlar. Charlie didn't hesitate. She remembered the sheer helplessness she felt in the alley when the knife had pierced her skin. She refused to be a victim twice. She gripped the 9mm with both hands, remembered to thumb down the safety exactly as she had seen in 100 movies, and aimed at the struggling mass. "Brutus, down!" she screamed with every ounce of authority she possessed. Miraculously, the highly trained dog obeyed, releasing the vest and dropping flat to the floor. Carter gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror as he scrambled to reach his dropped weapon. Charlie pulled the trigger. The recoil was brutal, snapping her wrists upward and sending a sharp jolt of pain through her sutured stomach. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed library. The bullet missed Carter's head by a fraction of an inch, burying itself deep into the leather binding of an encyclopedia directly behind him. Carter froze, his hand hovering mere inches from his gun. He looked up at Charlie. The terrified civilian was gone. Standing there was a woman with eyes as cold and unyielding as the mob boss she was currently sheltering with. "Kick it away," Charlie commanded, stepping forward, the smoking gun aimed squarely at the center of his chest. "Now." Slowly, Carter kicked his weapon across the floor. 2 minutes later, Demetrius and Silas burst into the library, their faces covered in soot, their suits ruined, weapons drawn and ready for a slaughter. What they found stopped them dead in their tracks. Carter was kneeling on the floor, his hands zip-tied behind his back, using heavy-duty medical ties Charlie had in her pocket. Brutus was sitting attentively beside him, ready to tear his throat out if he twitched, and Charlie was leaning heavily against a bookshelf, pale and exhausted, still pointing the 9mm directly at the traitor's head. Demetrius lowered his rifle, his dark eyes locking onto Charlie's. The look that passed between them wasn't one of relief. It was a profound, silent realization of mutual respect. She wasn't a liability to be protected. She was a survivor. "The perimeter is secure," Silas growled, walking over to haul the traitor to his feet by his collar. "The breach team is dead. We'll take out the trash, boss." Demetrius didn't look at Silas. He holstered his weapon and walked slowly toward Charlie. He reached out, gently wrapping his large hands over her trembling ones, carefully pointing the gun toward the floor and taking it from her grip. "You're safe now," Demetrius whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "You're safe." Dawn broke over the Pennsylvania countryside in a wash of cold, pale light. The estate was a chaotic scene of tactical cleanup. Black vans quietly arrived to remove the bodies of Vitiello's strike team, erasing the evidence of the Midnight War before the local authorities even knew a shot had been fired. Inside the massive, glass-walled solarium, Demetrius stood looking out over the frost-covered gardens. He had changed into a clean black shirt and slacks, but the tension in his shoulders remained wound tight. He had just given the order. Hard karma was descending upon New Jersey. Within the hour, 3 coordinated strikes, orchestrated by Silas, would hit Carlo Vitiello's safe houses. There would be no negotiations, no sit-downs, and no quarter given. The Vitiello syndicate was being eradicated root and branch. The ledger of blood was being balanced permanently. Soft footsteps on the marble floor drew Demetrius from his dark thoughts. Charlie walked into the solarium. She was wearing a thick, oversized cashmere sweater that belonged to him, her face pale but completely resolute. Brutus limped faithfully at her side, his grazed shoulder freshly bandaged. "Silas told me you ordered a car for me," Charlie said quietly, stopping a few feet away from him. Demetrius didn't turn around immediately. He stared at the frost on the glass. "The threat is neutralized. Carlo will be dead before noon. You are free, Charlie. I'm giving you a generous severance for your trauma. You can move to a new city, start a new practice. You never have to look over your shoulder, and you never have to see this darkness again." "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice steady. Demetrius finally turned to face her. The mask of the untouchable crime boss was completely shattered. In his eyes, Charlie saw a terrifying, profound loneliness. "It is what you deserve," Demetrius said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I am a monster, Charlie. I live in a world where men die for a misspoken word. You saved my dog, and I dragged you into a war zone. I almost got you killed twice. You belong in the light." Charlie stepped closer, closing the distance between them. She didn't look away from his intense, obsidian gaze. "I almost died in an alley because I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help," Charlie said softly, reaching out. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong and fast. "Last night, I didn't run to the panic room. I stayed and fought, because I couldn't walk away from you either." Demetrius inhaled sharply, his hand coming up to cover hers, pressing her palm tighter against his chest. "I don't want a new city, Demetrius," Charlie whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing down her pale cheek. "I don't want a normal life. I want to be exactly where I am." The restraint Demetrius had been brutally maintaining for weeks finally snapped. He pulled her flush against his body, mindful of her healing wounds, and brought his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, consuming, and filled with the terrifying reality of 2 people who had nearly lost each other in the crossfire. Charlie kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, fully accepting the danger and the darkness that came with him. At their feet, Brutus let out a long, contented sigh, resting his heavy head on Demetrius's polished shoes. The ordinary veterinary technician from South Philly was dead. In her place stood the new queen of the Costello Syndicate, forged in violence, bound by loyalty, and completely untouchable. Loyalty is a rare currency, but when spent in the darkest corners of the underworld, it buys the most unexpected devotion. Charlie Lawson's split-second choice to save a helpless animal thrust her into a violent syndicate war, transforming her from a civilian into a survivor, and ultimately, a ruler. She didn't just survive the Mafia's gilded cage, she conquered the heart of the man who built it, proving that sometimes the most profound love stories are written in blood and gunpowder.